The mountain man lost his memory in an avalanche until the obese girl's voice brought him back. The winter of 1825 came to the Rocky Mountains like a wolf descending on wounded prey, swift, merciless, and absolute. James Bridger McKenna had seen 23 winters in these mountains, each one teaching him new ways the wilderness could kill a man. He knew the language of the wind, could read snow like other men read newspapers, and had survived encounters that would have broken lesser souls. But even he couldn't outrun God's own hand when it decided to reshape the mountain. The hunting camp sat in a narrow valley, sheltered by towering pines and granite cliffs. 15 men worked there, trappers and mountain men who'd come together for the winter season, pooling resources and expertise. James had led them to this spot, promising rich beaver streams and elk herds thick enough to walk across. He'd delivered on both counts. The camp stores bulged with pelts worth a small fortune, and morale ran high despite the bitter cold. Then came the morning when the world ended. James woke to an absence of sound so profound it made his ears ring. The usual dawn chorus of camp life, men coughing, fires crackling, horses snorting, had been replaced by a silence that felt solid, oppressive. He sat up in his bedroll, every instinct screaming danger. "Up!" he roared, kicking his way free of the buffalo hide. "Everyone up! Move!" The other men stirred, confused by his urgency. Old Tom Bridger, no relation despite the shared surname, lifted his grizzled head. "What's eating you, Jamie?" The answer came not in words but in sound. A low rumble, distant at first, then growing like the voice of an angry god. James had heard it once before, years ago, and lived only because he'd been on the right side of the mountain. Avalanche, run! They ran. 14 men exploded from their bedrolls and tents, stumbling over supplies and each other in their panic. James led them toward the valley mouth, the only escape route that might offer salvation. Behind them, the rumble became a roar. The very air seemed to vibrate. James risked a glance back and saw death itself, a wall of white 50 feet high, devouring trees like they were twigs, obliterating everything in its path. The avalanche moved with impossible speed, defying the laws of nature, faster than any horse could gallop. They weren't going to make it. "Scatter," James bellowed. "Don't bunch up." Some men obeyed, others froze. The white wall crashed over them like an ocean wave, and James felt himself lifted, tumbled, compressed by forces beyond comprehension. Snow filled his mouth, his nose, his lungs. He couldn't tell up from down. Something hard, a tree, a boulder he'd never know, struck the side of his head with tremendous force. Then there was nothing. Consciousness returned in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly reassembling. Pain came first, a throbbing agony in his skull that made thought nearly impossible. Then cold. Then voices, muffled and distant. "This one's breathing, barely." "Christ, look at his head. That's a hell of a gash." Hands lifted him. The movement sent fresh waves of pain cascading through his skull, and darkness claimed him again. The next time he woke, he was indoors. A rough timber ceiling hung above him, gaps between the logs sealed with mud and moss. A fire crackled somewhere to his left, casting dancing shadows. The pain in his head had localized to a point above his right ear, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. A face appeared above him, weathered, bearded, concerned. "You with us, friend?" He tried to speak. His throat felt like sandpaper. The man brought water, helped him drink. It was the sweetest thing he'd ever tasted. "Name's Carson," the man said. "Kit Carson." "We're at Fort William. You've been out for 3 days." He processed this slowly. Fort William. He knew that name. It was important. But why? "What?" His voice cracked. He tried again. "What happened?" "Avalanche up in the valley. We heard it from 15 miles away. By the time we got there," Carson shook his head, Found 5 survivors out of 15 men. You were buried under 8 feet of snow, unconscious. Lucky we had dogs with us. 15 men, 5 survivors, numbers without meaning. He tried to remember, tried to grasp at memories that should be there, but found only emptiness. Who? He swallowed. Who am I? Carson's expression changed from concern to something darker. You don't know? I can't. Panic rose in his chest. I don't remember anything. An older man appeared, the fort's doctor, judging by the leather bag he carried. Dr. Silas Halloway had seen 40 years on the frontier, and his face carried the weight of every failure and loss. He examined the wound on the stranger's head with gentle, practiced hands. Severe concussion, Halloway muttered. Skull fracture likely. The brain is a mysterious organ, gentlemen. Sometimes trauma can erase everything that makes a man who he is. He met his patient's eyes. I've seen this twice before. One man recovered his memories after a month. The other never did. But you know who I am? The patient asked Carson desperately. We found papers in your coat, Carson said slowly. Contract for pelts, made out to James McKenna. That your name ring any bells? James McKenna. He rolled the name around in his mind, tasting it, testing it. Nothing. It might as well have been a stranger's name read from a tombstone. I don't know, he whispered. Dr. Halloway straightened. Rest. That's all you can do now. The mind heals in its own time, if it heals at all. Over the following days, the man called James learned the dimensions of his new existence. He could walk, though balance eluded him at first. He could speak, read, and write. Some skills remained intact, but the entire tapestry of his life, everything that made him who he was, had been torn away. Other survivors from the camp visited, trying to jar loose memories. They told him stories about his exploits, how he'd killed a grizzly with a knife, how he could track a deer over solid rock, how he'd once walked 100 miles with a bullet in his leg. He listened politely, but these tales described a stranger. The fort's commander, a pragmatic man named Colonel Ashworth, visited on the 6th day. He was blunt. McKenna, or whatever your name is, this fort can't support non-productive personnel. Winter's hard enough without feeding another mouth that can't contribute. Soon as the doctor clears you to travel, you'll need to move on. Move on where? James asked. I don't know where I came from. I don't know if I have family, property, anything. Not my problem, Ashworth said, not unkindly but not warmly either. This is the frontier. Everyone pulls their weight or they starve. That's just how it is. James understood. In a harsh land, sentiment was a luxury, but understanding didn't make the prospect of being cast out into winter wilderness less terrifying. He sat in the corner of the fort's common room that evening, watching the life swirl around him. Trappers and traders drank and told stories. A blacksmith hammered at an anvil. Women, the few who lived at the fort, went about their business with efficient purpose. One woman in particular caught his attention. She was large, perhaps the largest woman he'd ever seen, though he couldn't be certain since he didn't remember ever seeing a woman before 6 days ago. She worked in the kitchen attached to the common room, and he could hear her humming as she prepared the evening meal. When she emerged carrying a tray of bowls, several men made crude comments. She ignored them with practiced ease, distributing food to those who'd paid for it. When she reached James, she paused. You're the Avalanche survivor, she said. Not a question. Her voice was low, melodious, despite her obvious exhaustion. They say you can't remember anything. That's right. She set a bowl before him. This one's on me. You look like you need it more than most. I can't pay you back, he said quietly. I don't even know if I have money. Then don't pay me back, she smiled, and it transformed her face. Name's Margaret Brennan. You need anything, you let me know. She moved on before he could respond. James ate the stew, thick with venison and vegetables, and found himself watching her work. Margaret moved with surprising grace for her size, navigating the crowded room with efficiency. Men continued to make comments, some merely teasing, others crueler. She deflected them all with what appeared to be practiced indifference, but James saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched briefly before relaxing. She felt the barbs even if she didn't show it. 3 more days passed. Dr. Holloway declared James physically fit, though his memories showed no sign of returning. Colonel Ashworth made his position clear. James had until the end of the week to leave. "There's a trading post 2 days south," Ashworth said. "They might take you on as labor, or you could try heading back to civilization, see if anyone there knows you." Heading into the wilderness with no survival skills he could remember seemed suicidal. Heading to civilization, wherever that was, seemed only marginally better. James spent his final days trying to relearn everything, watching how men prepared for ventures outside the fort, listening to conversations about survival techniques. His body remembered things his mind didn't. When someone handed him a knife, his grip was perfect without thinking. When he walked, he unconsciously avoided making noise. But conscious knowledge was gone. The night before his planned departure, he sat alone in the common room after most had retired. He had no possessions except the clothes on his back and a small bundle of supplies Ashworth had grudgingly provided. No weapons, those cost money. No horse, same problem. He'd be walking into winter with almost nothing. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. The sight of him sitting alone seemed to affect her. She hesitated, then approached. "You're really leaving tomorrow?" "Don't have much choice." She sat down across from him, the chair creaking under her weight. "Can I tell you something?" "Sure." 2 years ago I arrived at this fort. I'd been traveling with a merchant convoy, cooking for them. When we got here, the merchant decided he didn't want to pay me what he'd promised, said I'd eaten more than I was worth. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "He threw me off his wagon. I had nowhere to go, no money, nothing." James watched her face, seeing old pain beneath the calm exterior. "The fort wouldn't take me in," Margaret continued. "Too many mouths already, they said. I was going to leave, try my luck in the wilderness. Would have died within a day, I expect. Then a trapper intervened. Big man, confident, the kind people listen to. He convinced the fort commander to give me a job in the kitchens. Said every fort needed good cooks, and he'd vouch for me." "Who was he?" James asked, though some instinct already told him the answer. "You," Margaret said simply. "You were that trapper. You didn't know me, had no reason to help. But you did anyway. Then you left on a hunting expedition the next day, and I never saw you again. Until now." James sat back, trying to feel something, recognition, memory, anything. But there was only emptiness. "I don't remember." "I know, but I remember." Margaret leaned forward. "I've been waiting 2 years for a chance to repay that kindness. Let me help you now." "How?" "Stay, not in the fort. Ashworth's made his position clear, but I have a cabin a 1/4 mile from here. Small place, but it's mine. Come stay with me. I'll teach you what you need to know. The fort won't care where you are as long as you're not using their resources." James studied her. "Why would you do this? Taking care of someone who can't contribute anything, teaching him from scratch. That's a burden." "Because someone helped me when I needed it," Margaret said firmly. "Because throwing people away when they're broken isn't right, no matter what this frontier thinks. Because—" She hesitated. "Because I can." In his position, with his options, refusing made no sense. But something deeper than logic moved him. This woman offered help without expecting anything in return, without judgment, without conditions. "I'd be grateful," he said quietly. "Thank you." Margaret smiled. "Come by the kitchen tomorrow morning. We'll head out together." Margaret's cabin proved to be exactly as advertised. Small, crude, but solid. 1 room with a fireplace, a bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs. Rough-hewn log walls chinked with mud. A single window covered with oiled hide. By frontier standards, it was modest, but sufficient. "You take the bed," Margaret said, setting down her bundles. "I'll sleep by the fire." No, James protested. You're the one doing me the kindness. I'll take the floor. They compromised. They'd alternate. That first night, James lay on the rough floor wrapped in blankets, listening to Margaret's soft breathing and the wind howling outside. He'd been terrified in the fort, but at least he'd been surrounded by people and structure. Out here, even a quarter-mile from civilization, the vastness of his ignorance pressed down like a physical weight. What if he never remembered? What if this empty feeling was all he'd ever know? Can't sleep? Margaret's voice came from the darkness. No. Me neither. A pause. Want me to tell you a story? A story? My mother used to tell me tales when I couldn't sleep. Fairy stories, legends, old histories. They helped? Another pause. Might help you too. All right? Margaret's voice emerged from the darkness, low and rhythmic, weaving words into images. She told him about a princess locked in a tower, about a clever fox who outwitted hunters, about ancient kings and lost treasures. Her voice had a quality that transcended the simple words, something soothing, hypnotic almost. James found himself relaxing, the tension draining from his muscles. He didn't drift off to sleep, but the fear receded. When Margaret finished, he thanked her. "Any time," she said softly. Thus began their routine. Margaret worked at the fort during the day, earning her keep. James stayed at the cabin, doing what he could to be useful, gathering wood, tending the fire, attempting to repair things that broke. His hands seemed to know what to do even when his mind didn't, which was both reassuring and frustrating. In the evenings, Margaret taught him. She started with basics: how to properly sharpen a knife, how to recognize edible plants, how to read weather signs. James absorbed it all desperately, but nothing triggered memories. "Don't force it," Margaret advised one night. "Dr. Halloway said the memories might return on their own, or they might not. Either way, you're still you, just a different you." "How can I be me if I don't know who me is?" "You're who you choose to be now," Margaret said firmly. "The past is gone for you at least, but the future isn't. You get to decide who you become." The words struck him deeply. She was right. Whatever he'd been before the avalanche was inaccessible. But he could choose who he was now, in this moment. At night, Margaret continued telling stories. She had an endless supply, tales from Ireland, where her family had come from, mixed with stories she had heard from Indians, trappers, and travelers. James began requesting specific types. He liked adventure stories, tales of heroes overcoming impossible odds. "Why do you like those?" Margaret asked one night. "Because they are about people who don't give up," James said. "People who face things they don't understand and push through anyway." "Like you," Margaret said softly. 3 weeks passed, then a month. Winter deepened and life contracted to the cabin's small walls and the daily struggle for survival. James learned to set snares for rabbits, learned which ice was safe to walk on, learned 100 small details that kept people alive in the wilderness. His body continued to surprise him. One day, a mountain lion appeared near the cabin. James reacted without thinking, grabbed a heavy branch, positioned himself between Margaret and the predator, and made himself large and threatening. The cat, perhaps surprised by the confident response, withdrew. Only afterward did James realize he had no conscious memory of how to face a mountain lion. "Muscle memory," Margaret said, pale but impressed. "Your body remembers even if your mind doesn't." It was true. When James held a knife, his hands found the right grip automatically. When he walked through snow, his feet found the most efficient path. His body was a map to his lost past, but a map he couldn't read. Margaret proved to be a patient teacher and surprisingly good company. She had a sharp wit beneath her quiet exterior, and she read people with uncanny accuracy. She explained the social dynamics of the fort, warned him about which men to avoid, identified who could be trusted. "You see everything," James observed one evening. "When you look like me," Margaret said matter-of-factly, People don't see you. They see what they think you are, lazy, gluttonous, worthless. So you learn to watch. You learn to listen, because nobody's watching you back. That's terrible, Margaret shrugged. That's life. Some people are born with advantages, others aren't. You work with what you have. James studied her across the firelight. For what it's worth, I see you, and what I see is someone extraordinary. Margaret's face went still. Then she turned away, but not before he caught the glisten of tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Winter began its slow retreat. The days grew infinitesimally longer, the cold marginally less brutal. James had lived with Margaret for nearly 3 months, and in that time he'd become a different person, or perhaps the same person rebuilt from different materials. He could survive now. Not expertly, not like the mountain men who traded stories at the fort, but adequately. He could set snares, read tracks in snow, start a fire in wet conditions. His hands had calluses, his body had hardened, his confidence had grown. But the memories never returned. "Maybe it's better this way," he told Margaret one evening. They sat together by the fire, closer than they used to sit, comfortable with proximity now. Maybe the old James wasn't someone worth remembering. "Maybe," Margaret said. "Or maybe he was exactly who you are now, just wearing different memories." Their relationship had shifted over the months. What began as caretaker and patient had evolved into something else, a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. James found himself noticing small things. The way Margaret smiled when she thought no one was looking, the melody of her evening stories, the competence with which she handled every challenge. He thought she might feel similarly about him. There were moments, a lingering glance, a soft word, a gentle touch, that suggested more than friendship. But both hesitated to name it, perhaps fearing that naming it might break it. Then came the day the stranger arrived. James was at the fort, trading rabbit pelts for supplies. Margaret worked in the kitchen as usual. The fort had filled with the usual midday crowd when the door opened and a man walked in. He was perhaps 40, lean and hard, with eyes that moved constantly, cataloging threats and opportunities. He wore a fur coat that had seen better days, and he carried himself with the coiled tension of a predator. The man scanned the room, and his gaze stopped on James. Recognition flashed across his face, followed quickly by something else. Calculation. Then the expression smoothed into false friendliness. "James McKenna," the man said, approaching. "Hell, I heard you died in that avalanche." James's heart hammered. Someone who knew him. Someone who could fill in the blank spaces. "I survived, but I can't remember. Do I know you?" "Know me? Hell, we were partners." The man stuck out a hand. "Nathan Greer. We trapped together for 3 years." James shook the offered hand cautiously. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't identify what. "Partners?" "That's right. Worked the mountain streams, split everything 50-50. Greer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "When I heard about the avalanche, I figured you were gone. But here you are. That's remarkable." From the kitchen, Margaret watched the interaction. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the stranger's body language, predatory, false, dangerous. Her instincts screamed warning. "You really don't remember nothing?" Greer asked. "Nothing before the avalanche." "That's a shame, real shame." Greer scratched his jaw. "Tell you what, I've got a camp about a day's ride from here. Why don't you come back with me? Maybe seeing familiar places will jog your memory. Plus, you've got property there. Traps, pelts, supplies, all yours." "Property?" "Sure, unless you want to leave it all sitting there?" Greer shrugged. "Course, it's your choice. Just thought you'd want to reclaim what's yours." It made sense. If James had been a trapper, he'd have equipment and goods somewhere. Recovering them would give him resources, independence. But something about Greer made his skin crawl. "I need to think about it," James said carefully. Greer's smile thinned. "Don't think too long. Mountain camps don't stay safe forever. Other folks might decide abandoned property is free for the taking. He left shortly after. James stood frozen, trying to process. Margaret hurried over. "Don't trust him," she said urgently. "You heard?" "Some, but mostly I saw." Margaret gripped his arm. "James, that man is lying. I don't know what about, but he's lying." "How can you tell?" "I've seen 1,000 men lie to me," Margaret said, "about why they didn't pay me, about why they touched me without asking, about why I deserve to be treated like trash. I know lies when I see them. That man is lying." James wanted to dismiss her concern as paranoia, but Margaret had proven perceptive about everything else. If she sensed danger, he should listen. "What do you think he wants?" "I don't know, but it's not to help you." They returned to the cabin warily. James found himself checking the shadows, expecting something. Margaret barred the door that night, which she'd never done before. "Tell me a story," James asked when they'd bedded down. Margaret's voice emerged from the darkness, weaving tales of brave knights and treacherous villains. But tonight the stories felt different, warnings rather than entertainment. James lay awake long after she finished, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in his forgotten past, he'd apparently known Nathan Greer. But Greer had felt like an enemy, not a friend. What had the old James done to inspire such calculated malice? 2 nights later, James woke to silence. Complete, oppressive silence. The same quality of silence that had preceded the avalanche. His eyes snapped open. The fire had burned down to embers. Moonlight filtered weakly through the hide-covered window. Everything appeared normal. But something was wrong. James rose silently, every sense alert. Across the room, Margaret slept soundly in the bed, exhausted from a long day's work. He moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the hide. 3 figures moved through the trees, approaching the cabin. They advanced with deliberate stealth, weapons drawn. Even in the dim light, James recognized the lead figure, Nathan Greer. Terror and rage flooded him in equal measure. Margaret had been right. The man had come for what? What could James possibly have that warranted a nighttime attack? No time to puzzle it out. 3 armed men against 1 unarmed man in a cabin with nowhere to run. The odds were catastrophically bad. James grabbed the only weapon available, a heavy splitting axe used for firewood. He positioned himself beside the door and shook Margaret awake, pressing a hand over her mouth before she could cry out. 3 men coming, he whispered urgently. "Stay behind me. Be ready to run if I tell you." Margaret's eyes went wide with fear, but she nodded. She rolled out of bed, grabbing a kitchen knife, and crouched behind the table. The door crashed open. Nathan Greer entered first, pistol drawn, 2 other men behind him with rifles. They expected to find their victims sleeping, easy targets. Instead, James swung the axe in a brutal arc. The axe blade caught Greer's pistol, sending it flying. Greer howled and stumbled back into his companions, disrupting their formation. James pressed the advantage without thinking, his body moving with practiced efficiency his mind didn't remember. The second man, young, nervous, tried to bring his rifle to bear. James pivoted, using the axe handle to knock the barrel aside just as the rifle discharged. The shot went wild, blowing a hole in the cabin wall. James reversed the axe and slammed the blunt end into the man's face. Bone crunched, and the man went down. The third man, older and more experienced, circled wide. He aimed his rifle carefully at James's chest. This was it. No way to close the distance before the man pulled the trigger. Margaret moved. She hurled her kitchen knife with surprising force. It wasn't an accurate throw. The knife tumbled clumsily through the air, but it struck the rifleman's shoulder, point first. The wound was minor, but the shock and pain ruined his aim. The rifle shot went high. James crossed the distance in 2 strides and swung the axe again. The man tried to block with his rifle. Wood splintered as the axe cut through the stock, but the blow lost enough force that it only knocked the man unconscious rather than killing him. That left Greer. He'd recovered his pistol and now aimed it with both hands, face twisted in fury. "Should have stayed dead, McKenna," he snarled. "Why?" James demanded. His heart hammered, but his hands stayed steady on the axe. "What did I do to you?" "You don't even remember, do you?" Greer laughed bitterly. $3,000 in gold dust, Jamie. Payment for a winter's worth of pelts. You said you'd keep it safe in camp until we got back to civilization. Then the avalanche hit, and I figured it was buried with you. But when I heard you survived," he shook his head, "can't let you live if there's a chance you remember where you hid it." Understanding crashed over James. Greer wasn't a former partner. He was a thief who'd been waiting for the chance to steal, and the avalanche had provided the perfect opportunity. "I don't have your gold," James said. "I don't remember anything." "Maybe, maybe not. Can't take that chance." Greer's finger tightened on the trigger. James did the only thing possible. He threw himself sideways, trying to make himself a harder target. The pistol barked. Pain seared across his left shoulder as the ball grazed him. He hit the floor hard and rolled. His head struck the stone base of the fireplace, the same side that had been injured in the avalanche. Stars exploded across his vision. Pain like lightning split his skull. Through the agony, he heard Margaret scream, "James, wake up! Don't leave me!" Her voice, that particular voice, with its distinctive low, melodious tone, the sound of it, combined with the blow to his head, triggered something catastrophic in his injured brain. Memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. The avalanche, the hunting camp, years of wilderness wandering. His entire life, rushing back in a chaotic flood of images and sensations. He remembered everything, including Margaret. A year before the avalanche, he'd been at Fort William briefly, resupplying before heading back to the mountains. A young woman, large, frightened, clearly desperate, had been surrounded by drunk trappers who'd thought her size made her fair game for mockery and groping. James had intervened, scattering them with threats in his reputation. He'd spoken with the fort commander on her behalf, convinced them to give her a chance. She'd thanked him with tears in her eyes. He'd left the next day and hadn't thought about it again, just another good deed in a life of pragmatic survival. But Margaret had remembered. Margaret had been waiting for a chance to repay that kindness. And when he'd returned to the fort broken and helpless, she'd recognized him and taken him in. All of this flashed through his mind in the space between heartbeats. James surged to his feet, his body now reconnected with a lifetime of survival skills. Greer stood over him, pistol empty, reaching for a knife. They met in a violent collision. Greer was dangerous, skilled with a blade. But James was more than skilled now. He was whole, mind and body unified for the first time since the avalanche. They grappled across the cabin, smashing into furniture, trading blows and cuts. Margaret watched in horror, clutching her bloodied knife, wanting to help but afraid of hitting James in the chaos. The two men were evenly matched, but James had one advantage. Greer didn't. Something to fight for. He thought of Margaret's kindness over the past months, her patience, her gentle teaching, the way she'd given him dignity when the fort had been ready to throw him away like trash. The sound of her voice in the darkness, telling stories to chase away his fears. Fury gave him strength. James trapped Greer's knife arm, twisted, and drove his opponent backward into the stone fireplace. Greer's head hit the stones with a sickening crack. He slumped, unconscious. Silence descended on the wrecked cabin. James stood in the center of the destruction, chest heaving, bleeding from multiple cuts. Margaret stared at him, still holding her knife defensively. "Margaret," he said, and his voice carried recognition now, memory, everything that had been missing. I remember everything." Her expression cycled through confusion, hope, and fear. "Everything? You saved me once before, at the fort, 2 years ago." He moved toward her slowly, hands open, non-threatening. "I intervened when those men were harassing you, convinced the fort to hire you. I didn't think it was anything special, just the right thing to do. But you remembered." Margaret lowered the knife. "You remember that?" "I remember all of it. The avalanche, the camp, And you, I remember you. James stopped a few feet away. When I forgot everything, when I was nothing, you gave me back my life. You gave me back myself, me. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. I was so scared. When that man shot you, when you fell, I thought I'd lost you again. You didn't. You couldn't. James closed the remaining distance and took her hands. Margaret, these past months with you, even without my memories, they were the best months I can remember. And now that I have all my memories back, I know they were the best months of my life. Period. She tried to pull away. Don't say that. Don't say things you don't mean just because I helped you. I'm saying it because it's true. He held her hands gently but firmly. For years I wandered these mountains alone. I survived. I thrived even, but I was alone. I told myself that was how mountain men lived. That solitude was the price of freedom. He paused, making sure she was listening. I was lying to myself. I was lonely, Margaret. So lonely I couldn't even admit it. Then I lost everything in the avalanche and had to start over. And you were there. You showed me what life could be when you had someone to share it with. I'm not what you want, Margaret whispered. Look at me. I'm not beautiful. I'm not graceful. I'm just a fat girl who cooks at a frontier fort. You're wrong, James said firmly. You're the woman who saved me twice. You're patient and kind and clever. You see things others miss. You have a voice that can chase away nightmares. You gave a broken stranger dignity when no one else would. And yes, you're beautiful. Maybe not in the way frontier fools think is valuable, but in every way that actually matters. Margaret sobbed once, then pulled him into an embrace. James held her, and for the first time since the avalanche, for the first time in years, if he was honest, he felt complete. The three attackers were secured and hauled before Colonel Ashworth the next morning. Two of Greer's companions proved to be opportunistic criminals who'd signed on for easy money. Faced with the prospect of frontier justice, they confessed everything. Nathan Greer and two other men had been part of James's original hunting party. While James was away from camp checking traps, the three had stolen the accumulated gold, payment for pelts sold to a trading company, and hidden it. They'd planned to claim James had abandoned them with the gold, but the avalanche had struck before they could execute their plan. Most of the camp had died, including Greer's two original conspirators. Greer alone had escaped with the location of the stolen gold. When he learned James had survived but lost his memory, he'd seen an opportunity to eliminate the last threat to his treasure. 3,000 in gold dust, Colonel Ashworth said, examining the documents the criminals had carried. That matches the manifests from the trading company. Legally, that money belongs to you, McKenna, as the expedition leader. The courts will decide what happens to these three. James nodded. I'll press charges. They tried to kill an innocent woman. That's worth hanging in my book. The three men were locked in the fort's small jail to await transport to the nearest court. It would be months before they faced trial, but frontier justice was harsh with violent criminals. Their prospects were grim. With the immediate crisis resolved, James faced more important questions. What now? He'd recovered his memories and his property. His former life lay open before him. Return to the mountains, trap furs, live the solitary existence he'd known for years. But that life held no appeal anymore. He'd learned something crucial during his months without memory. The man he'd been wasn't necessarily the man he wanted to be. Come with me? Margaret asked tentatively. They sat in her restored cabin. James had spent 2 days repairing the damage from the fight. I know you could go back to mountain life. You're famous for it, but... But, James prompted gently, but you said you were lonely. And she swallowed. I don't want to be alone anymore either. James took her hand. I'm not going anywhere, unless you want me to. I don't. Good. Then we need to make plans. The $3,000 in gold dust provided resources James had never possessed. Combined with his skills and Margaret's business sense, they had options. James proposed an idea that had been forming since his memories returned. "This region needs supply stations," he explained to Margaret and Colonel Ashworth. "Places where trappers and travelers can stop safely, resupply, rest. I know the routes. I know what people need. Margaret knows how to run a kitchen and manage provisions. Together we could establish a trading post and way station." Ashworth considered. "Location?" "South of here, where the main trail forks toward the passes. 3 days from Fort William, 2 from Fort Benton. Right distance for travelers needing rest." James had scouted that area years ago. "Good water, timber for building, defensible position." "Competition for the fort," Ashworth noted. "Compliment," James countered. "We'd handle short-term travelers in small groups. Fort William serves military and major trading operations. Different markets." Ashworth nodded slowly. "Might work. You'd have my blessing for what it's worth." It took 4 months to make the plan reality. James used his gold to purchase supplies, tools, and livestock. He hired workers to help clear land and construct buildings. Margaret designed the layout, a main building with kitchen and common room, plus smaller cabins for private lodging. During those months, James and Margaret's relationship deepened. They worked side by side daily, their partnership as practical as it was romantic. James taught Margaret wilderness skills she'd never learned. Margaret continued teaching James things his memory hadn't restored, reading and writing, which he'd known but forgotten, plus history and literature from her extensive mental library. "You've read more books than anyone I've ever met," James observed one evening. "My father was a school teacher," Margaret explained, "before he died and left us with nothing. He taught me that education was something no one could steal. So I read everything I could find, memorized everything I could." She smiled sadly. "Fat lot of good it did me on the frontier." "It did me good," James said firmly. "Your stories kept me sane when I was lost. Your knowledge helped me relearn everything. Don't dismiss what you know." The trading post took shape through summer. A solid 2-story main building, 4 cabins for guests, a stable for horses, a smokehouse for preserving meat. James blazed trails and marked paths to make the location easier to find. Margaret stockpiled supplies and tested recipes for feeding large groups efficiently. In September, they held an informal opening. Word had spread through the frontier network of trappers and traders. Curiosity brought the first visitors, rough men who'd known James in his mountain days, skeptical that the famous loner had become a businessman. But the post's advantages became clear immediately: clean lodging, hot food, fair prices, and safety. Margaret's cooking impressed even the most hardened trappers, and James's reputation provided security. No one wanted to cause trouble at an establishment run by a man who'd killed a grizzly with a knife. Most surprisingly, Margaret's evening storytelling became the attraction. James had encouraged her to continue the practice publicly. Every evening after dinner, Margaret would seat herself by the common room fire and tell stories. Folk tales, legends, historical accounts, adventures from distant lands. Men who'd traveled hundreds of miles through harsh wilderness would sit quietly, listening to her melodious voice weave tales of other times and places. "It's like church," one old trapper said to James, "but better." Business thrived. Within 2 months, they'd recouped their initial investment. Within 4, they were profitable. The trading post became a landmark, a place marked on the mental maps of everyone who traveled the region. More importantly, James and Margaret built a life. Not the life James had known before, solitary, hard, perpetually moving. A different life, one with routine and comfort and partnership. A life where they fell asleep each night in the same bed and woke to face challenges together. In December, almost exactly a year after the Avalanche, they married. Kit Carson served as best man, having become a friend during the preceding months. Colonel Ashworth attended, along with 50 trappers, traders, and travelers who'd come to respect the unusual couple running the trading post. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple but elegant, accommodating her size rather than fighting it. James wore his best frontier clothing, cleaned and mended. They spoke their vows before a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, and no one made crude comments about the fat woman marrying the famous mountain man. "I thought I'd lost everything in that avalanche," James said during his vows. "Turns out I had to lose everything to find what actually mattered." 2 years later, James stood on the porch of the trading post, which they'd named Brennan's Rest after Margaret's family, and watched travelers arrive. A wagon train of settlers heading west, seeking their fortunes in the Oregon Territory. They'd stop here for a few days, resting and resupplying before tackling the mountain passes. Movement inside caught his attention. Margaret emerged, carrying a swaddled bundle. She'd given birth 3 months earlier to a daughter they'd named Sarah. The pregnancy had been difficult, complicated by Margaret's weight and age, but both mother and child had survived. James took his daughter carefully. Sarah had his dark hair but Margaret's eyes, and she watched the world with solemn curiosity. Fatherhood had terrified him at first. What did he know about raising children? But Margaret's patience extended to this as well, and they'd learned together. "Large group," Margaret observed, watching the settlers. 20 wagons, they'll need provisions and repairs, good business. "And tired people who will want stories," Margaret added with a small smile. The evening storytelling sessions had evolved. Margaret still told traditional tales, but she'd begun incorporating true stories from the frontier, carefully edited versions of events she'd witnessed or heard about. Settlers loved these, finding inspiration in tales of survival and success. One story in particular had become requested frequently. The tale of a mountain man who lost everything in an avalanche, including himself, only to be saved by a woman whose voice brought him back. Margaret told it as fiction, as legend, but everyone who'd been in the region for any length of time knew the truth. "The mountain man lost his memory in an avalanche," they'd call out, requesting the story. "Tell us that one." And Margaret would tell it, embellishing certain parts, downplaying others, but keeping the heart intact. A story about loss and salvation, about kindness repaid, about two unlikely people finding each other. James often wondered what his life would have been like if the avalanche had never happened. He'd probably still be wandering the mountains alone, respected but isolated, wealthy in furs but poor in meaningful connection. The avalanche had stripped away everything, but in doing so, it had given him the chance to build something better. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked quietly. She'd learned to read his thoughtful silences. "Giving up the mountain life?" "Never," James said honestly. "I had years in the wilderness. I know what that life offers. This," he gestured at the trading post, at the arriving settlers, at his wife and daughter. "This is better. I spent so long surviving. Now I'm actually living." Margaret kissed his cheek. "Good answer." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, watching their small empire bustle with activity. Workers unloaded supplies, travelers unhitched horses, children ran between cabins, playing games. The trading post hummed with life and purpose. Nathan Greer and his accomplices had been tried and hanged a year earlier. The stolen gold had been recovered from its hiding place and legally recognized as James's property. That money, combined with the trading post's success, had made them wealthy by frontier standards. But wealth wasn't what mattered. What mattered was this: a daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms, a wife whose voice could chase away nightmares, and a home built not from logs and stones, but from second chances and stubborn hope. "Tell me something," James said to Margaret. "That first night when I came to your cabin, when I was lost and broken and useless, did you know this is where we'd end up?" Margaret considered. "No. I thought maybe I'd teach you enough to survive on your own. Maybe you'd recover your memories. Maybe you wouldn't. but I thought you'd eventually leave, move on to whatever life you were meant to have. When did that change?" "The night you told me I was extraordinary," Margaret said softly. "No one had ever said that to me before. People had called me useful, efficient, adequate. But extraordinary? That was new. That's when I realized you saw me. Really saw me, not just the fat girl in the kitchen. After that," she shrugged, "after that I started hoping you'd stay." James shifted Sarah to one arm so he could take Margaret's hand with the other. "Best decision I never consciously made." That evening, after the settlers had eaten and paid for their lodging, Margaret took her customary seat by the common room fire. The audience gathered, weathered travelers, curious settlers, children dragged along by parents but secretly eager for stories. "Tell us about the mountain man," a child called out. Margaret smiled. "Again? You've heard this one before." "Tell it anyway," a settler woman said. "These stories give us courage for what's ahead." So Margaret told it once more. The tale of James and herself, disguised as legend, but true in every way that mattered. About a man who lost himself, about a woman who saved him, about kindness repaid and love discovered in unlikely circumstances. James listened from his position at the bar, having heard the story dozens of times but never tiring of it. Margaret's voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm, drawing listeners in, making them feel the fear and hope and triumph. When she finished, applause filled the room. Children begged for more stories. Margaret obliged, moving on to tales of clever foxes and brave knights in distant lands. James served drinks and made change and kept order, but mostly he just watched his wife work. Later, after the guests had retired and Sarah slept in her cradle, James and Margaret sat together by the dying fire. The trading post creaked and settled around them, full of sleeping people who'd found temporary refuge in this small island of civilization. "Happy?" James asked. "Very," Margaret said. "You?" "More than I knew was possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the frontier stretched away in all directions, vast, dangerous, full of hardship and beauty. But here, in this small place they'd built together, there was warmth and safety and love. James McKenna had died in that avalanche. The man who emerged from the snow had been a blank slate, frightened and lost. But that man had learned who he wanted to be, guided by a woman whose voice could reach through darkness and bring him back. Now he was someone new. Not the solitary mountain man who'd walked alone for years. Not the confused stranger who'd forgotten his own name. Someone better. Someone who'd learned that being saved wasn't weakness, and that the best adventures were the ones you shared. Sarah stirred in her cradle, making the small noises of a baby dreaming. Margaret rose to check on her, and James followed. They stood together over their daughter, watching her tiny face in the firelight. "We should write it down," James said suddenly. "The real story. Everything that happened, not the legend version, so Sarah can know how her parents found each other." "Would you want her to know all of it?" Margaret asked. "The attack, the theft, the violence?" "I want her to know the truth, that life can take everything from you and you can still come back, that kindness matters, that the right voice at the right moment can change everything." James put his arm around Margaret's waist. "That sometimes you have to forget who you were to discover who you're meant to be." Margaret leaned against him. "All right, we'll write it down. Together." "Together," James agreed. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, the sound of the wilderness that had been his home for so long. James felt a momentary pull, the old instinct to answer that call, to walk alone through the dark forest. But Sarah made another small sound, and Margaret's hand tightened on his and the pull faded. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness. This was where he belonged now. Here, in this trading post with his wife and daughter, building something that would outlast them both. Here, where every evening brought voices and laughter and hope into the darkness, the trading post would grow. In 5 years, they had had a blacksmith shop. In 10, a small school where Margaret would teach reading and writing to children of settlers passing through. In 20, Sarah would take over much of the daily operations while James and Margaret grew old together, still telling stories by the fire each evening. But all of that was future. Tonight, there was just this: a family together, safe and warm, having found each other through impossible circumstances. James McKenna had forgotten everything: his name, his past, his very identity. But in forgetting, he learned the most important lesson of all, that who you were mattered less than who you chose to become. That love could be found in unexpected places. That sometimes the voice of one good person speaking kindly in the darkness could call a lost soul back from the void. Margaret had spent her life being overlooked, dismissed, judged for her appearance rather than her character. But she'd never let that dim her compassion or her courage. When she'd seen a broken man who needed help, she'd given it without hesitation, without expectation of reward. And in doing so, she'd saved not just his life, but her own. "Come to bed," Margaret said softly, touching his arm. "Tomorrow will bring new travelers, new challenges. We need rest." James nodded. He took one last look around the common room, at the sturdy walls he'd built, at the tables where strangers became friends over shared meals, at the fireplace where Margaret's stories brought wonder to hardened frontiersmen. This was his legacy now, not pelts and solitary survival, but community and connection. They climbed the stairs to their private quarters above the common room. Sarah's cradle sat beside their bed, and they checked her once more before settling in themselves. Through the window, stars blazed in the clear mountain sky, the same stars that had watched over James during his years alone in the wilderness. "Tell me something," Margaret whispered in the darkness. "If you could go back, before the avalanche, knowing everything you know now, would you choose differently? Would you try to avoid it?" James considered carefully. The avalanche had killed 10 good men. It had stolen months of his life, caused tremendous pain and fear. It had nearly killed him twice, once in the snow, once at Greer's hands. But it had also led him here. "No," he said finally. "I wouldn't change it. Those men who died, that's a tragedy I can't justify. But for myself, the avalanche didn't take my life. It gave me a new one, a better one." "Even though you lost so much?" "I thought I lost everything," James said. "But I was wrong. I didn't lose everything. I lost the inessential and kept what actually mattered: the skills, the strength, the ability to choose who I wanted to be. And in the process, I found you." Margaret's hand found his in the darkness. "I spent 2 years hoping you'd come back to the fort. When you did and you didn't remember me, I thought that hope had been wasted. But it wasn't." "No," James agreed. "It wasn't." They lay together in comfortable silence. Below them, the trading post creaked and settled, full of sleeping travelers dreaming of their destinations. Outside, the wilderness stretched away into infinity, beautiful and dangerous and free. James McKenna had been a legend once, the mountain man who could survive anything, who needed nothing and no one. That legend had died in an avalanche. In its place had emerged something better, a man who'd learned that needing someone wasn't weakness, that accepting help wasn't failure, that the truest strength came from connection rather than solitude. His last thought before sleep claimed him was gratitude. For the avalanche that had broken him, for Margaret's voice that had called him back, for the second chance that had become a better first chance, for the fat girl whose kindness had saved a mountain man's life, and in doing so, had given him a reason to truly live.